First of all, I'd like you all to stand up, please. Thank you very much. Good. And can I ask you to stay standing if you or a member of your family has ever experienced mental ill health? So you've all had some experience of someone, either you or your family, who's had mental ill health. Okay, wow, that's amazing. You're my first ever talk where absolutely everybody has... Oh, one person has sat down. Okay, so Mr. Functional at the back. Okay, everybody else is staying standing. Great. Okay, I'd like you now, please stay standing if you have felt able to be completely open about your illness or the illness in your family with your friends and family more widely. So if you felt able to be completely open about what's happening to you or what's happening to your family. Okay, so we've got roughly 2/3 of you then sat down. Finally, I'd ask you to stay standing if, with your experience of mental ill health or experience of mental ill health in your family, if you felt able to be completely open in your place of work or with professional colleagues. Okay. Okay, so we have 3 people still standing in the room. Thank you very much. Please sit down. I think that's very interesting to immediately establish what we're dealing with the topic of mental illness, mental ill health, and the stigma that is still so incredibly widespread, and that even an audience such as you, who are interested in this topic, only half of you, or a third of you, felt able to share it with your friends and family, and only 3 of you in this room felt able to talk about it in your workplace. So that's why I'm so keen to start this conversation and to be here today. And what I'm going to do, I need a clock. Have we got a clock? We've got a clock behind me. Okay, so we've got an hour. And what I'd like to do is in the first, I'm going to talk for around 40 minutes. And if I go on for more than 40 minutes, will you all please stand up again and say, that's enough, shut up, we're done. Because sometimes I run over in my enthusiasm. So I'm going to talk for 40 minutes, going to all try and keep an eye on the clock. And then we've got 20 minutes for a conversation, which I would urge you to feel that this is a safe room and this is a safe place where we can have that conversation. You can talk about what your experience is in a way that we've already shown you didn't feel able always to share with your other friends and family. Because if we are, as a society, to deal with the stigma that still exists around mental health, then we need to be having that conversation. Great. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend about 10 minutes just telling you a little bit what happened to me, and then I'm going to spend another sort of 20-25 minutes sharing with you the strategies that I use every day to ensure my own good mental health. Because I would say that I manage my depression and I manage my tendency to anxiety pretty well. And it's taken me a good 10 years to get there. And therefore, I'd like to share with you some of the things that I do to ensure good mental health. So first of all, a little bit about me. So I'd like you to rewind back to 1997. So we've just had the Blair landslide election, probably before most of you were born, not quite sure. No, maybe not quite. And I'm working very hard. I'm a journalist. I'm in the newsroom at the Times, and I love my job. It's what I've dreamed of. I've ticked lots of boxes. I've worked hard at school. I've got the grades. I've been to a good university, and I got my dream job at the Times. And meanwhile, my husband is also working very hard, again, excited about his job. He is a junior banker at Goldman Sachs. And in addition, he's just stood in the 1997 election in Manchester, where we have been living. And he's failed to get a seat. But nonetheless, it's an exciting time for us as a couple. We have 2 small children, but we have a lot on. We have demanding jobs, we have small children. And I am quite an anxious person anyway. And I want to do everything. I want to do the job, I want to be the mother, I want to be the political wife, I want to be the regular wife. I want to, you know, in the famous cliche, have it all. And I think I'm doing pretty well. I think I am pretty much having it all. Anyway, that's just the context. So one night, it's a Wednesday, I can't get to sleep. Now, insomnia is a big characteristic of anxiety and depression. Anybody here suffer from insomnia? Yeah? Okay. Okay, it's a very classic symptom of depression. And I'd had insomnia before, but this insomnia was different. With the insomnia came some very unpleasant symptoms, and I had no idea what they were. So my heart started to beat up, and I began to feel rather sick. In fact, I did start to vomit, and my head was kind of bursting. It felt a little bit as if I had sort of maddened wasps stinging the inside of my head, and my worries were going crazy. I'd always been a bit of a worrier, but there I was as the clock ticked by, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, I was worrying. Who was going to look after the children in the morning? Was I going to get to work? How was I going to manage all these responsibilities? And if I was dog tired, I wouldn't manage any of them. So I was more and more desperate to get to sleep, more and more unable to get to sleep, more and more suffering. These really quite unpleasant symptoms. And I didn't sleep. The next morning I thought, okay, I'll get up, I'll do what you would imagine, I'll refast an activity to its normal time, I'll breakfast at breakfast time, I'll lunch at lunchtime, I'll dine at dinner time, and I'll sleep at bedtime, and I'll get back to normal, to my busy, successful, career-orientated life. Unfortunately, the next night, I still didn't get back to sleep. My anxieties deepened. I felt it's a bit like a skater where they go round and round and round and round, deeper and deeper into the ice. And these physical symptoms were getting worse and worse. And I'll just show you my first slide, because one of the things I'm very interested in, and I think is fairly well, not that well understood, is the kind of physicality and the unpleasant physical symptoms that go with depression. So in my view, there isn't this hard line between, on the one hand, a mental illness and on the other hand, a physical illness. The two are intimately connected. So there I was, worse and worse and worse. By the Friday, I was in screaming agony with these symptoms. I thought I was having a heart attack, and I was taken to hospital after I'd seen my GP, and I was absolutely astonished to find that I was in a psychiatric hospital. And I was even more surprised when this strange man said to me, well, I think this is the start of a depressive episode. And I said, but no, no, you got the wrong person. No, I think it must be a cardiac arrest. No, I must be, no, depression, that's not me. No, I've got a good life. No, I'm not depressed. I said, okay, whatever. So I'm just going to show you this first slide, because when I put some work into finding out a bit more about depression, I hope this one works. There we go. I'll just give you a moment to read that. So back in '97, I didn't know what was happening to me. I came across this much more recently. It's written by someone called Dr. John Horder, who's the head of the Royal College of GPs. And what's interesting about John is that he did actually suffer a heart attack. And in addition, he suffered liver cancer. And what he said was that the physical pain of a serious, severe depressive episode, like the one I was suffering back in '97, was worse. So this was electrifying to me, this idea that I wasn't the only one who found that depression has incredibly unpleasant physical symptoms, or it can do. And funnily enough, I was talking to him last week and I said, I was pretty ill, wasn't I, back in '97? Do you remember? And he said, yeah. He said, yeah, you were pretty ill. He said, I'd put you about the midpoint of people who I'm admitting to psychiatric hospitals on a daily basis. That's roughly how ill you were. That's roughly how bad your pain was. And there was no question that I was suicidal. And the reason I was suicidal was not because I didn't have a good life, a wonderful husband, 2 children, all these things I told you about, was because of this physical pain. Speeding up the story, I was ill for 6 months, by which I mean I was in bed, unable to function, and I did get better. But what was interesting, and we're back in 97, remember, so rewind in your minds to the start of my talk and have a little memory of that stigma that exists now, 2014. So back in 97, I went back to the Times. I told no one. Didn't really even believe myself that I'd had this thing called depression. I don't think it's a good idea in my job to share the idea that I had been, quote, mentally ill. I had to tell one line editor, you know, I'd been out of action for 6 months. You know, he'd known that, whatever. But on the whole, I shut the topic down, didn't talk about it to my friends and family, did not share it with my workplace, and I carried on exactly the same. I did absolutely nothing to change my life. I kept going at the Times, and indeed I had more children, and I upped the demands on myself even more. My psychiatrist says that my personality type is kind of what you might call a sort of anxious striver. So I kept on going, and most unfortunately, 7 years later, I had a second breakdown. And this time, I was twice as ill, and I was ill for a year. This is a very common characteristic of depression, which is that subsequent episodes tend to be worse, and they're harder to recover from. And it was only at that point, so this is now 10 years ago, that I basically, in the dreadful cliche, woke up and smelled the coffee and thought, okay, who would have thought I have this tendency to depression? And not only do I have a tendency, I have had 2 major depressive episodes, and I've knocked out the best part of 18 months of my life, being unwell. And it was at this point that I decided that I really had to start looking much more closely at what depression really meant, what was it about me, my lifestyle, my character that made me susceptible, and more importantly, what could I do to make sure that I didn't have a third episode? Because the knowledge I live with is that if I do have a third episode, it almost certainly will be worse than the previous 2. So my desire to really get on top of this was really quite huge, you might say. And that was when I began to research the subject, spend much more time on it, get much more involved with it, work with other people who suffered from anxiety and depression, work alongside mental health charities, and try and find out what was this thing called depression and what could we do about it. And what I discovered, and I invite you all to do the same, is if you go on the Royal College of Psychiatrists website, as I did, and you look and you say, well, what are the reasons for depression? Why did someone like me get depression? It amazingly lists 7 different factors, which is one of the problems that we have, which is that we don't really know why someone falls victim to depression. People used to think it might be genetic. That was the great white hope. We'd find this gene, and people would be, proven to be susceptible. They haven't found the gene. The website is wonderfully vague. It says things like, well, circumstances can contribute to depression. Yeah, I got that. Not a great idea to be commuting to Manchester from London and trying to work in the newsroom and all these things. I got the idea of circumstances. Anyway, i.e., there isn't any real clarity on exactly why it happened, why it happens. It can, and the last, one of the 7 reasons, what they call unexplained, but it just kind of comes out of nowhere. Having said all of that, there's no doubt that there are things you can do to improve your mental health. And what I would urge is that, obviously, prevention is much better than cure. So if you can introduce into your life strategies to look after your mental health, just like you might go to the gym and look after your physical health, which of course is also good for your mental health, you can probably reduce your chances. But much more than that, maybe you're going to enjoy the ride because you're going to have better mental health as you go along. So despite a sort of disillusionment, you might say, of not being able to say, okay, it was that meant that I went victim of depression, it didn't stop me thinking, okay, I can still do things to improve my mental health, and so can you. And what I would say about some of the strategies that I'm going to go on to talk about is that they are experiential. And by that I mean you have to actually experience them. It's no point just saying in theory, you know, mindfulness is a good idea. The only way any of these strategies work is you actually have to spend the time doing them. You have to actually change your life and introduce time when you focus and think about your mental health as much as you would about your physical health. Because the exciting thing is that your brain has plasticity, it can change, you can do things to make yourself a less anxious person and to improve your mental health. But the only way you can do it is you actually have to do it. I know it sounds very obvious, but a lot of the things I say are quite obvious, but the key thing is that most people don't really do them because they don't really necessarily understand quite how unpleasant possibly depression can be, or sort of think they think they're fine. Well, I thought I was fine. Okay, so we're going to go on to some strategies. I just like this picture. Kind of famous work-life balance. How do you get it right? What I think I learned is that the biggest person in that picture is the person in the middle. And I think that for me, I didn't really have any sense that I needed to look after my own health. I was thinking about the children, I was thinking about the office. I didn't really think about me. And I think there was something in there about the idea that somehow maybe it was sort of selfish or narcissistic to prioritize my own health and my own mental health. And what I would say is that quite the opposite. It's almost as if you have a kind of moral duty to put yourself first, to look after your health, to learn more about your mental health, in order to be able to fill all the other roles that you want to do, all the other, functions in society that you want to do. So that was a sort of shift in attitudes, you might say, rather than defining yourself as, someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's employee, someone's student, someone's whatever it is, to think in terms of you come first. Okay? Now, the thing about breathing is you might think this was really obvious, and we all breathe. But actually, there's a whole world of using breathing exercises in a very different way to just sitting here now when you're all breathing in and you're breathing out. And when I was in hospital, the second time, things had moved on. And what we know is that if you're physically relaxed, you're mentally relaxed. So mind and body are intimately connected. If you're mentally tense, you're physically tense. So a lot of the approaches to depression are talking therapies and about trying to change the way you think. I'm sure you all know about cognitive behavioral therapy and trying to adjust the way you think. And we'll look at some of the psychological approaches in a minute. But the thing is, I don't know if you've ever tried it, it's actually very hard to change the way you think. The clever thing about some of these physical strategies is they just turn the whole thing the other way up. They say, well, maybe you can't control this racing mind. Maybe these anxieties, maybe there I was, couldn't sleep, panic. Maybe there was going to be nothing I could do about my crazy head. Depression is an illness, your brain goes wrong, like something else can go wrong. But turn it round, anyone can learn to work with breath and breathing. And this is what I learned, and I use it all the time. So I was a little bit rushed this morning because I managed to get on a later train than I planned. And I was sitting there, coming here, and I just did some breathing. So my mind was raised thinking, gosh, where's the psychology about? I know myself very well. I relax myself with some breathing, and the simple, basic message of all these breathing exercises, and there's lots of them around, is that when you breathe in, we can all do it now, close your eyes, and when you breathe out, you basically breathe out for twice as long as when you breathe in. And you can use it all the time, and it's a really good trick lowers your cortisol, lowers your adrenaline, helps with this point that I'm making, is that if you're physically relaxed, you're mentally relaxed. Okay, so that's one thing I use all the time, and I wished I'd known about it before. Diet. You all know what you should be eating. Everybody knows about fruit and veg and all the rest of it. I've been very lucky. I've done quite a lot of work with nutritionists who are now looking very closely at the links between mood and food. And the truth is that psychiatrists don't really like this much because basically it's something you can do on your own. And psychiatrists like to give you drugs. And often you do really need those drugs. I'm not in any way diminishing the importance of psychiatrists. But the world of nutrition and what's happening in terms of research is very exciting because you can do it yourself. And briefly, I'll hand on to you what I use all the time is we now have quite a lot of research around low mood and low levels of vitamin B. A really good idea if you're anxious, susceptible to low mood, vitamin B. The other one is vitamin D. Almost everybody is deficient in vitamin D because there's low levels of sunlight. Is exactly why depression levels go up. More people present with depression in the winter months. And one very simple thing is just to take a vitamin D supplement. The last thing I'll say on nutrition is that you all know about serotonin. And serotonin is a good thing. It's the feel-good factor. It's the thing in your brain that helps with low mood. And it's made from something called tryptophan. And tryptophan is something you can find in what you eat. You can find it in turkey. You can find it in oats. You can find it in bananas and some dairy foods as well. So it's a really great idea just to help your body in the way that I was explaining. Turn the whole thing on its head. Maybe you can't fix your mind right now. You can help your body become a less anxious place by feeding it properly and looking after itself. So I'm very, very careful what I eat. We all know about the mood rushes that go with sugary foods. I don't know if you can become very aware, observe it in yourself. If you eat a sugary donut, you might immediately feel better and your mood will crash. I'm afraid the same is true of alcohol. Nobody really wants to come clean on this in this mental health world, I'm afraid, because the problem is that so many people with low mood and depression and anxiety use alcohol to self-medicate. And it's so incredibly understandable. You're feeling low. What do? You have a drink. Unfortunately, it's exactly the same effect on your brain, which is the sugar goes up, the whoosh from the alcohol, and you crash lower than before. And this is incredibly important, especially with the combination of insomnia, which is a key characteristic of depression and anxiety, because many people will have a drink and they'll think, great, that's going to get me off to sleep, and then they'll wake at 3 or 4, and early waking is another key characteristic of depression. So it's a bit of a hard message to say don't drink at all. I don't drink at all, but that's because I've had to take rather extreme measures to look after my mental health. But I just share that with you. The comment I would make about insomnia, which is just so crucial, was something that my psychiatrist shared with me, and it was really as though a light bulb went off. And actually, you can apply this to lots of things. And what he shared with me is that insomnia itself is not the problem. Our bodies are actually quite clever. If you're up at night and you don't sleep enough, at some point your body will feel tired and you will go back to sleep. And very enlightened employers are now building this in and moving away from a very rigid structure that we're up in the day and we're asleep at night. So I don't know if any of you know the work of Arianna Huffington, who set up the Huffington Post, but she's very obsessed by these sleep pods. And amazingly, at the Huffington Post offices, there are actually sleep pods where people can catch up on sleep if they've missed sleep the night before. So what he explained to me is that the lack of sleep itself doesn't matter. The thing that really matters, and the thing that did me in when I suffered my first depressive episode, is the worrying about not sleeping. It's that anxiety, it's the catastrophic thoughts, which are characteristic of depressive thinking. So you go, oh my God, I can't sleep, I won't be able to do my exam tomorrow, I'll be thrown out of Leeds University, I'm never going to get a job, no mortgage, I'm on the street, I'm homeless. Classic, catastrophic, anxious thinking, and often triggered with anxiety. So what I'm saying to you is if you do suffer from anxiety, or those around you suffer from anxiety, or those people you're talking to, somehow if you can get them to work out that the lack of sleep itself is not the problem, it's worrying about it that's the problem. And we're going to go on to talking about what you can do if you are suffering from a lot of worries. I'll just give you a moment to read that. Okay, anybody come across Middlemarch? Anybody read Middlemarch? No? Anybody know George Eliot? Yes? Someone at the back? Okay, so George Eliot, famous 19th century English novelist, a woman, but in those days it wasn't acceptable to be a woman novelist, so took the name George Eliot. And the reason I use this, and the reason I like this slide so much, is that the three words, well, they're four words actually. There's four words here that really, I suppose, sort of summed up my psychological shift, my kind of worldview, turning on its axis after my second breakdown, when I started to kind of, what you might say, look at the world differently and adjust, really, my own aspirations and what I wanted. And the four words are dependent on unhistoric acts. And I absolutely love that. And when I first read it, I thought, I can't believe it. This is where I'm sort of edging towards. Because we live in a world which is very obsessed with what you might call historic acts. And I was obsessed with historic acts. I wanted to be a famous journalist. My husband wanted to be a famous politician. We wished for worldly success, what you might call outward show. And if anything, since I was first ill, that kind of pressure to have a kind of public outward profile, a kind of historic record of what you are and what you stand for, is much worse. And you all know about the pressures of social media, but we live in a very quantified world. How many Facebook hits? You know, how many Twitter followers? How many website this? How many books have you sold? How many people show up to your talks? How many friends have you got? How, all your grades. There's much more public and what you might call historic evidence of where we stand and what we are and what, what's important, supposedly. And what I found for me, that a different view of the world, a world where unhistoric acts are important. You might say random acts of kindness. Nothing that is going to make you famous, go on your social media profile. A completely different kind of view of what's important to you. I got a lovely email this morning, actually, which I felt was so on theme to what I believe. It was a quiz. And it said, can you list the last 5 Oscar, main actress winners? Can you list the last 5 Booker Prize winners? Can you list the last 5 Nobel Prize winning scientists? And of course, none of us can. And the reason is because if we look more closely, these what you might call worldly aspirations are not really what matters to us. What matters to us are our relationships, our community, our sense of connection, and our sense of behaving with purpose and with a kind of sense of kindness. So that's why I really like this quotation about unhistoric acts and about small acts of random kindness. I'm not then saying have no ambition, but I'm saying it's a very different psychological way to sort of start each day, if you see what I mean. And actually it's a way that actually a lot of therapeutic work works, which is developing a kind of a gentler, more compassionate inner voice, rather than the kind of striving, onwards and upwards type of voice. I'm sure you all know about mindfulness. It is a very good thing, and I do use it. Like a lot of approaches to depression, it has mixed outcomes. So with depression and approaches to it, there's fashion. Just like there's fashion in everything. Right now, mindfulness is absolutely at the top of everyone's wish list. And rightfully so, because as I say, it can be very effective. But what I would say, and as a general rule, I'm saying this about all the things that I'm talking to you about, it doesn't work for everybody. Just like nutrition doesn't work for everybody, exercise doesn't work for everybody. Sometimes I meet someone and they say, well, what do you do? And I say, well, I work in the field of mental health. And they go, well, you don't have a problem. And I go, well, actually, yes. And then they go, well, I just go for a run. And you think, well, that's great. That works for you. You go for a run. It doesn't work for everybody. So what I would say about mindfulness, I started about, when I was talking about these strategies, is they're experiential. You've got to actually do them. The thing about mindfulness is the challenge is actually incorporating it into your day. And what I'd say about that is what I do, and I'd like to share it with you, and everybody can find something different that works for them, is to choose a mindful activity and then do it. So what I do is I do hand washing. Your activity needs to do something that you would normally do, but you do it in a very different way, with an awareness, with an ability to pause. So the characteristic of depression is that you worry about the future and you regret the past. You are not in the moment. So choosing an activity can be a very useful device to have kind of full stops through your day when you stop and you pause. And crucially, you appreciate. Because one of the characteristics of depressive thinking is that you focus on the negative. And actually, back on the savannah, this is exactly what we needed to do to survive. There was the saber-toothed tiger, and if you didn't worry, you would get eaten up. But obviously, we don't have that world now, but our brains were set up like that. So we have to actively help our brains switch from this sort of fight or flight kind of survival anxiety state to a state of calm and gratitude. So what I like about hand washing is that I feel the temperature, I smell the soap, I enjoy the sensuality of it, and I just take that moment to stop, to pause, to feel grateful, to lower my stress levels, to lower my adrenal and my cortisol, and to help with my anxious mind. So I do recommend it. There's many other things you can do with mindfulness, but using a mindful activity has been very helpful for me. I think this is the point I was really making earlier, this thing around kindness. And it's a big theme of mine, and I think it's a big theme of how people with mental illness are treated generally. And if you work with people with mental illness or anxiety, depression, other mental illnesses, what very, very common theme that comes back is what they really want is a feeling that they've been treated kindly and with compassion. And that is often lacking, partly because of lack of resources and partly because basically people who suffer poor mental health are not very kind to themselves. They haven't developed a kind of inner compassionate, you know what, it's fine, you're just good enough just as you are. So I think back to when you're lying awake at 4 in the morning and how you're going to deal with all your anxieties and worries, somehow this idea of developing a kind of sense of kindness is very important. And there is some scientific evidence. You probably know it had an old people's home, and they gave half the old people pot plants, and they had to be responsible for looking after them. And the other half of people in the old people's home didn't have any pot plants. Basically, the outcomes of people who have to access their own compassion and kindness are better than the outcomes of people who don't have to engage, connect, and feel that sense of compassion and our kind of common humanity and our relatedness. Okay, anybody know who that is? It's pretty hard. No one's ever got this yet. So if you don't recognise him. Okay, so he's called George Herbert, and he's a 17th century poet. He was one of the metaphysical poets. He was a contemporary of people like John Donne. He was known as Holy... Oh, look, the time. I'm going to have to really whiz now. We've got 3 minutes to do poetry. Okay, poetry is a big thing of mine. It's a very useful strategy for me. It keeps me in the moment. It requires concentration. I have to unpack meaning. I have to be there. I have to be present. And in addition, it gives you very positive healing messages and mantras, which can be very helpful to change the narrative in your head from negative to positive. And I'm very excited. A lot of work now is being done with poetry therapy. Scroll back. Apollo was the god of medicine, the god of poetry. The ancient Egyptians used to dissolve on papyrus, healing mantras and swallow them. Benjamin Franklin set up his hospital in the 18th century. He used literature as part of his canon to help people get better. And now there's some work around what happens to your brain when you tell yourself a different story. And a poem can be a very helpful way to do that. That's just a couple of lines from Herbert, which I've always found helpful, because one thing that people need who are unwell, who are suffering from mental illness, is a sense of hope. So that second line, who would have thought my shriveled heart could have recovered greenness, to me is a message of hope, as indeed is the top one. This is Emily Dickinson. Did anybody know that? It's my next question, but you did? Yeah, literary lady at the back. Excellent. She also writes very well about hope. She has this image of a small bird as a symbol of hope. There's lots of poems which use birds, actually, as symbols of hope. And back to what I was saying, lots of things, the outcomes are quite poor of lots of different treatments of depression. We all know that antidepressants don't work for everybody, and they certainly don't work straight away for everybody. And in that period, when you are in recovery or hoping to get recovery, what you really need is hope. And sometimes a poem can give that to you. And this is my last slide, and I'm going to end here, which is basically saying there is no roadmap. Everybody here will find different strategies, different approaches, the people you're working with, to help with their mental health. And I've just shared some of the things that help me. And you may have been sitting there thinking, gosh, what's she on about? That doesn't work for me at all. And that's absolutely fine. Because, as I say to you, first of all, there were those 7 factors on the Royal College of Psychiatrists' website. We don't really know why people suffer from depression. And the other end of the uncertainty is we also no one approach has sorted the problem. Neither talking therapies, neither CBT, neither drugs, neither exercise, neither diet, neither all the different things that people try. But what normally works best is a kind of combination. So what I'd say is that I'd urge you to find your own kind of combination of whatever will help you through. And I hope that something I've said will resonate, and maybe you'll take away, and maybe if you are up at 4 in the morning, you might find something that will help you get back to bed. Thank you very much. Great.